Good evening, everyone. I am so honored to welcome you here. My name is Edward Wiltshire. I'm the curator of lectures at Town Hall Seattle. And on behalf of Town Hall, our hosts here at the beautiful First Baptist Church, and our partners at University Bookstore, who are set up in the chapel behind you, if you haven't had a chance to visit them yet, we are so honored to welcome you to this evening's program with Jose Vargas in conversation with Ijeoma Oluo. This event is being presented by Town Hall as part of our civic series in this season, where these civic series events are feeling pretty intense for us, but we thank you for being here and participating. Part of Town Hall's Inside Out season, as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll be returning to our beautiful space down the hill early next year, so keep an eye out for that and more Town Hall programs all around town. In case anyone just came in late, we are collecting questions on Q&A cards tonight. I'll be going around right after this and collecting them. If there's any more in the audience, my colleague is in the back doing so as well, and we'll collect those a little bit later on. But in order to frame tonight and actually properly introduce our speakers, we've invited Jorge Barón, the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, to say a few words about the state of immigrant rights activism here in the state of Washington, and then to welcome our speakers. So Jorge, please come to the stage.
Thank you so much, Edward, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We want to thank everybody at Town Hall for their work throughout the year and for making this event possible. Really appreciate everybody coming tonight for this important event. As Edward mentioned, my name is Jorge Barón, and I'm the Executive Director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. For those of you who are not familiar with NIRP, as we like to call it, our organization is the largest provider of immigration legal services to low-income community members here in the state of Washington. Now, most of our work is focused on providing direct legal assistance to immigrants pursuing protections like asylum or family visa petitions, or defending individuals who are facing deportation hearings, including those who are detained at the Northwest Detention Center. And I want to acknowledge that as we gather here this evening, there's around 1,500 community members who are detained right now at the Northwest Detention Center, about an hour from here. In addition to our direct legal services, we also engage in systemic advocacy to change unjust policies and practices, and engage in community education to help ensure community members are aware of their legal rights and the realities of our immigration system. If you want to find out more about our organization, there's materials at the front area. But before I turn about the talk tonight, I want to acknowledge the current moment because our organization serves a large number of survivors of sexual and gender violence by helping them apply for asylum and other humanitarian protections. And we and I are keenly aware that the events of the past few weeks, and particularly the last 48 hours, have resulted in re-traumatization for many in our community. I therefore want to acknowledge survivors and express our solidarity. We pledge to respect and honor the voices of courageous survivors and to honor them by working to end these forms of violence in our society. And now it is my honor to introduce our two distinguished speakers. First, Jose Antonio Vargas, who is a Pulitzer-Prize winning journalist, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and a leading voice for the human rights of immigrants. He is the founder and CEO of Redefining American, the nation's leading nonprofit media and culture organization that fights injustice and anti-immigrant hate through the power of storytelling. And just on a personal note, if any of you, and if you have to endure Twitter, I will encourage you to follow Jose, just to be amused at the way he responds to a lot of people who are coming after him and who are encouraging ICE to actually go after him and keep asking him if he's still in the country, and he's always responding, yes, I'm still here. And we're pleased that he's here with us tonight. And also with us, Ijeoma Oluo. He is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and activist. Her work has been published in The Guardian, The Stranger, Washington Post, Elle Magazine, NBC News, and elsewhere. She has been the editor-at-large at The Establishment since 2015. Her New York Times bestselling first book, So You Want to Talk About Race, was released in January 2018 with Seal Press. Jose's book, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Jose Antonio Vargas and Ijeoma Oluo.
So, funny story is we were back there talking about the Kardashians.
We were.
I'm not joking. And then we heard clapping, and so we're like, oh, it's time to go. And then we came out, we're like, oh, no, it's not. And so that's why we were just standing back there. So it's just another thing that Kanye West ruined. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it is such a pleasure to sit across from you. I have followed you on Twitter now for a couple years.
We only know each other on Twitter.
Which is a very deep relationship. I mean, there are people I know in person who I don't follow on Twitter, even though I know they're there.
So when I was, they said that my publisher was saying that we're gonna have a Seattle stop. Who do you want to moderate the conversation? First person I thought of. And I'm just so happy and so pleased that you're willing to do it, so thank you.
I was honored. I think you actually messaged me on Twitter.
Yeah,
to ask.
I was like, yes.
And it was quite an honor, and I said absolutely yes, and I'd actually just told my intern, no more events, and then I was like, oh, but this event, and I had to send her a message being like, I already said this one. But it's a real pleasure, and it's such a pleasure to talk about your book and talk about your work. And it's always interesting, I think, when I'm talking to people who do work like this, because you're like, oh, and it's more necessary than ever. And I never say that enthusiastically, because I think oftentimes when you're doing work like this, you kind of wish it wouldn't be quite so necessary. But it is, and this is a beautiful book. And of course, your work has been really beautiful. And I guess first, I would love to just talk a little bit about, what brought you to this book. I mean, I know part of it's in the book, so don't give any spoilers.
Yeah.
But what it was like, the process that you decided, beyond just, a couple years ago stating your status here, but I'm going to actually really document this. I'm going to put this in something people can hold in their hands. What was that like for you?
I really didn't want to do it. So some people here may know that I publicly came out as undocumented in the New York Times in 2011. And before that, the last thing I did was I wrote the first big profile of Mark Zuckerberg. And so after I profiled him for the New Yorker, people offered me a book deal to write a book on Zuckerberg. And I said, actually, there's this other thing that I gotta go do first. So then 6 months later, I came out as undocumented, and then they wanted me you should write about that. I didn't want to do that. Instead, Define American, which is this organization that I founded 7 years ago, I really wanted to focus on growing this organization and not talk about me anymore. Because it's hard to do that, especially because as a journalist, I've always been trained to not put yourself in a story, right? And originally, when I started thinking of if I were to do a book, I wanted to do a book on global migration. I wanted to do, if you see the book, if you've bought it, part of the dedication is the 258 million migrants in the world. The United Nations came up with that number a couple years ago, and I was really struck by that number. Apparently, it's the largest ever movement of people in global history. And then what was even more fascinating was when you dig into the numbers, realizing that the great majority of migrants are migrating to countries that previously colonized or imperialized them. The Indians in the UK, the Senegalese in France, Filipinos in the United States, right? There's 4 million of us here, including a lot of people in Seattle, including at your airport. I can't, whenever I go to your airport, I feel like I'm in the Philippines. It's amazing. There's so many Filipinos at the airport. And they're like, hey, you're still here. I'm like, yes, I'm still here. So I wanted to write a book about global migration. And I wrote an entire book proposal about that. Nobody wanted it. They said, we wanted you to talk about your life. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. And really, what happened, and I wrote about this in the book, as you know, is I ended up, I was living in downtown LA. I was living in an apartment that was always my dream apartment, which is Fraser's apartment. I was like, if you get a Fraser apartment up in the sky with a big view, that's when you've made it in life. So I had this big Fraser apartment. And then about a month after the election, the building manager texted me and said, we're not sure what we would do if ICE showed up. we're not sure we can protect you. Which is kind of, I'm like, I pay my rent, what are you talking about, you know? So then so that kind of crystallized my predicament, which I have been kind of like, oh, it's okay, they're not gonna, you know. I never really, it never crystallized in that way. And so after that, I packed everything up in this big apartment, put it in storage, and I haven't had a place since. So I wrote this book kind of to get into that. So the book in many ways is really structured around what that feels like. And when I must have read 40 immigration books, right? Edwidge Danticat, you know, the Haitian American writer, is just fantastic. She's novels, you know, some nonfiction, but I read a lot of her stuff. I read John F. Kennedy's really landmark book called The Nation of Immigrants. But what was lacking for me was capturing this idea of being here illegally right now. And the editor of the book said, can you list the 15 most painful moments in your life? What?
That sounds like a party.
What was that?
I said, that sounds like a party.
She was awful. It was awful. So she made me do that, and it took me like 3 weeks, I think. It was right around Christmas. And then it was fascinating how every moment that I wrote about was either I was lying about something, I was trying to pass someone else, or I was hiding. So that gave the book structure: lying, passing, and hiding. And what I liked about it was you don't have to be undocumented to relate to that, right? And so that's how this was born. And as you know, I've been saying that I've never had therapy before because I thought Frasier was really screwed up when I was growing up. So like, what's the point of getting therapy? And you know, people of color, it's just not, there's still stigma around that. So this is like the closest to therapy I think I've ever gotten, is writing this book.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about not wanting to write it too, because I did not want to write my book either. And my editor kind of talked me into it, and I'm very glad she did. But I think that there's something when you're writing about these issues, especially as a person of color, writing about social issues, that you're certainly not the first person to write about or talk about or beg and plead about. And you always have to include all these really tough personal stories. And you have half, you know, for me, like, I know half of it was I was always very glad for people of color who could find themselves in these stories and relate. But half of me was always kind of bitter that there was going to have to be this blood and tears in order for people to understand a very basic truth that, like, racism's bad, or, you know, that, you know, or in your case, that undocumented people are people, you know, and that, you know, even though these stories have all been told over and over and over again, that we get to keep still opening up. Did it ever get to feel exploitative, or in the interviews about it feel like
that's
extractive?
been honestly, when I was writing this book, what I didn't want to get into was this whole performative thing, where I feel like I'm just, you know, especially writing about my mom, which I find so personal, like, I don't even know her, and I don't want to have to share her with you because I don't know who she is. You know, it's been 25 years, and so how am I going to be honest about that? And how do I write about it in a way that's not for you, but for me? So for me, the grounding thing that I had to really think about the book, and as you know, Toni Morrison's influence, there's a whole chapter just about the master narrative and what Reading the Bluest Eye like did for me. But you know, I remember when I was a kid and I would watch these Bill Moyer interviews with Toni Morrison on PBS, thank God for PBS. She would say that she wrote not for white people, without what she called the white gaze, right? I thought a lot about that because I think a lot of what I've been doing for the past 7 years is going all across the country, including in places that don't want me there, to talk to mostly white people about why I'm not a threat. And I didn't want to do that. Oh, hi. But we're in Seattle. This is not Arkansas, you know, not Alabama. So, but I didn't want to do that. So this book for me, now this is going to sound maybe selfish, but I actually wanted to write the book for myself. I wanted to understand the chief question for me was, what happens when the government that you're a part of doesn't see you? Like, where's that severance of the self from the government, right? And I was just talking to a reporter from San Francisco a couple of days ago who was writing about the book, and she said to me, I read the book now twice, and I just realized that immigration reform, the phrase, is nowhere to be found in this book. Was that intentional? I said yes. Just, to me, that's not the conversation. Like, the conversation for me is not what DACA is, or the DREAM Act is, or the fact that, you know, only 12 states, thankfully, which includes Washington State, allow us to drive. I don't want to talk to you about policy and politics. I just want to talk to you about what this actually feels like inside. Because for me, especially in a moment like this, I feel that that was the most access. It felt the most kind of fertile. Right? Because look, you can go to the New York Times and the Atlantic to figure out why they can't pass immigration reform or why ICE is the most rogue, you know, agency in the country. They can tell you that. This is like, I didn't understand the cost of family separation or what it means to hide from the government, which means actually you end up hiding from yourself. I didn't realize all of that until I actually had to write it. So that's why I had to, for me, totally your point, to do that, writing this from that claiming the center instead of saying, I'm the marginalized person explaining it to all of you. In this book, my goal was, and Toni Morrison says, I stood at the border, stood at the edge, and claimed it as central and forced people to come to me. So that was my goal.
Wonderful, beautiful.
Yeah.
Did anything surprise you when you were writing it? You know, did you find out things kind of about yourself? I know sometimes, especially when you're delving into your life and your history, it's different from if you're used to writing assigned pieces, where you're at a certain place with that piece. You come prepared to the piece, but when you're writing a book about your life, you're not necessarily fully prepared. Were there parts of it that surprised you that you maybe weren't ready to delve into yet?
The mom stuff, that was the most, like, finding language for what it means to not see, you know, like, the hardest thing to write was the very beginning, which is remembering what happened when she put me on a plane at the airport when I was 12. I was totally shocked how much I didn't remember. I didn't remember what she said other than, here's a jacket, it might be cold there. I didn't remember what I said to her. I didn't remember if I hugged her or kissed her. And then the journalist in me was like, let me go call her and ask her what happened. Or I called my cousin. There's a version of this book where I actually called my cousins and had them explain to me what was happening in the socio-political history of the Philippines at the time. But I was 12, and it felt like I was just I was putting on my journalist hat to hide my personal self. So writing a lot about her was the toughest. And for me, what happened was, in the book, I write about being detained in Texas 4 years ago. You know, this was during the time when this country didn't think that those kids were kids, right? Because, you know, we had locked up kids in cages 4 years ago. When CBS News, the headline was, illegal immigrant children, right? And no one cared. I mean, I remember, I'll never forget, I used to cover Hillary Clinton when I was a political reporter. I'll never forget Jorge Ramos asking Hillary Clinton, should those children be sent back? And Hillary Clinton said, oh yeah, they should be sent back. Like, you know, the fact that Hillary Clinton, who has been championing children's rights since she was in Arkansas, she couldn't even say what she needed to say because she knew the moment she said it, it'd be political, right? It wasn't until I was in a jail cell locked up with those boys that I saw my mom, because I kept imagining what their moms and their dads said to them before they walked, and if they would remember. Because, you know, the boys were maybe 5 years old to 14 years old. And you could tell that they didn't know where they were. And I was such a confusion to them because I look like this. And whenever the guard would, after they arrested me, they figured out that I was a famous person, whatever that even means. So the guards keep going to the jail cell. So they would say, Jose Antonio Vargas, and all the kids would be like, and no hablo español, I don't speak Spanish, right? And one kid actually started, I could tell he wanted to play with my hair, because, you know, big Asian hair, you know, and, but I didn't see myself until I saw those kids, and then my mom became clearer. So that was interesting, it took sitting in a jail cell to, like, confront my mom in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting too because I think, your story starts before now, and it starts before your mom, of course, right?
Yeah.
The story starts, we look at these very difficult decisions that families make all of the time, and and your story goes back through colonialism and through all of these other things. And then also, though, the story of the way in which undocumented people are treated right now goes back before Trump. And you were talking about the Clinton years, and and I remember those images of children on a bus.
Yeah.
And during the Obama years.
Yep.
And I remember the lack of outrage. I remember the people cheering the buses. And I think that it's important for us to realize that these stories go deep, but they go deep because we didn't look at what was happening, and we didn't see people as human beings. And I think that, part of what we have to get down to, and what I like about the book is, there are fundamental truths about human beings and how we are or are not willing to treat people, and that should not matter who is in office before we start looking at these things and calling it unconscionable. And undocumented people were treated as political pawns, have been for so long. And, I firmly believe that if the Obama administration hadn't tried to give so many, at least surface level, hard stances in the beginning of his administration to the right, we wouldn't have really normalized that kind of mass deportation that Trump has been able to do now. And the problem is that even on the left, we didn't see undocumented people as people.
It was never a priority. Like every report that's been come out of the progressives have listed immigration, I think, below fifth, right? Like I think usually legalizing marijuana, which is fine, great, congratulations. I think that's important. I was just in Oregon last night. Yeah, I was just in Portland, and the same year that Oregon made marijuana legal was the same year that they took away our right to drive, right? And I actually brought it up to the audience. I'm like, did you know that this is about 200,000, estimated 200,000 undocumented Oregonians. And it's not like there's a subway system across the state. Like, how are people getting around, right? And I think whenever we think of this issue, this idea of immigration reform, the idea that the Democrats are the only ones who want to do something about it, right? It has gotten so locked up in that perspective, and I really feel that it's going to take this awful, awful time that we're living through to kind of push the reset button and figure out the language is all off, the framing is all off, right? The fact that we're not even asking the why and the how. Like, why are they coming, right? It's way more complicated than the Statue of Liberty and the American dream. Those kids don't know what the American dream is. What they do know, and what I did see, was that many of the kids' shoes were Nikes, Reeboks, and Adidas, right? So American companies can go all over the world, right? So that American companies can have global markets. This iPhone right here, can be manufactured in China, delivered to Cupertino, end up in New York where I buy it. Goods, companies, travel without borders, and yet what are we doing to people, right? And even that question of, as I said, I'm Filipino. In Seattle, Carlos Bolosan is, the epigraph of a book is by Carlos Bolosan, who's buried on Queen Anne here in Seattle. And I was at this event in North Carolina, and this man said, because I was talking about how there's 4 million Filipinos in the United States, as far as we know, including Bruno Mars, Vanessa Hudgens, Darren Criss. Yes. So I said, there's 4 million of us here, and he goes, why are there so many of you here? In a very belligerent way. And thankfully, I'm my grandmother's grandson, so I'm pretty polite. I try to be. And all I can say, sir, we are here because you were there. That's why we're here, right? So, and he goes, what do you mean? Sir, the Spanish-American War. I mean, that's why my name Jose, which is Spanish, doesn't have an accent on the E, because when you took over the Philippines, when you brought your typewriters to the Philippines, there were no accent marks. So that's why when you see, Asian-looking people with Spanish names and without Spanish accents and the Anyes, they're Filipino. So, and their names, our names, is combination of Spanish colonialism and American imperialism. So meaning it's way more complicated than saying they're here to steal your jobs, which by the way, that's not true either. So Trump to me is only a manifestation of every lie and every myth we ever told ourselves about who we are. The question though, at a time like this is, are people actually willing to learn? Do people want to actually ask harder questions than let's go pass immigration reform? Are we really connecting dots? So you and I were talking about, the one thing that I'm proud about Define American is no immigrant rights and racial group associated organization has been as inclusive as we are in terms of making sure that Native Americans and African Americans are always a part of what we're doing, right? Because you know how people like to say, oh, this country was built by immigrants. When you say that, you're leaving off two fundamental groups of people, right? And I think we like to say that because we don't want to have to complicate it. And even now, we just did a study, Define American just did a study that said that the most underrepresented group of people in terms of the stories we tell on television are actually Black immigrants, right? Like, so that's something that Define American is going to work on now, is how do we improve the portrayal of Caribbean, African immigrants, Afro-Latinx people, right? Inclusion really means inclusion, but it's a lot of work. It's not easy, you know? People throw around the word intersectional like it's like something that you can just put in your pocket and like walk with it. Like, you have to really take that out and be like, what does that look like? How uncomfortable do people feel about it? You know, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we were talking back there about, you know, this idea of immigration reform. Yeah. People carry it around like it's a resistance weapon or something, as if you could, first of all, how do you reform a system that has never at any point in its history not been extraordinarily exclusionary and racist and exploitative? Yeah. What do you reform it to? What are you going to turn it to? And I think that, you know, while I do know how governments work and that there are these processes, what people should be striving for is a fundamental change in how we look at humanity and look at citizenship, not even just in a legal standpoint.
Well, I mean, the right-wing organizations are already complaining about, oh, now he's claiming to be a citizen, because I put the citizen in the title card. Because, you know, I love Tucker Carlson and I like messing with him. I figured he's gonna hate that. Kidding, no, that's not, I don't care about Tucker Carlson. But you know, that actually, you know, in the book I talked about this because it was a really pivotal moment, again in North Carolina. I don't know, things happen in North Carolina. And I was doing this event and this elderly Black woman approaches me after the event and she said, young man, I gotta go talk to you. And she said, I'm not an immigrant. And then she pulled out this piece of paper, which was really old and crumpled. And it was a bill of sale. I'd never seen one before. And she said, my great-great-grandmother landed in Charleston and was given this piece of paper. So can you connect the piece of paper that she got to the pieces of papers that you and your people can't seem to get? Then she goes, it's not about papers, young man, think bigger. And then I remember talking to Alicia Garza, you know, one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, about that conversation. And Alicia said, well, Jose, you know, this was like 2014, I think, 2015. And she was saying to me that the Black Lives Matter movement is about citizenship, not about papers, but citizenship as dignity. Yep. And so then I sent an email to all these immigration groups that I'm you know, aware of. And I said, well, wait a second. So do we actually think we pass immigration reform, all of a sudden 11 million people are going to feel welcome in this country? Is that all it's going to take? Poof, all of a sudden you're welcome. Especially now when Trump, I think for me the most underreported context that's happening, it's really dangerous, is the Trump administration has blurred the lines between illegal and legal. Yep. Right? Any sort of immigration reform bill that the Democrats is going to sign on is going to include cutting legal immigration by half. Do we really want to do that? Just so we can placate Republicans or whatever? And so the question for us, for me, has always been, how do you define American? And now the question at a time like this is, what constitutes citizenship? Beyond just the papers, right? And the law. Like, what does it mean for us to know that our lives are actually, you know, this is a marriage, what we have. And we have to share a space together. And what does that look like?
You know, I think it's interesting the way in which, I think oftentimes there's so many different ways in which levels of privilege can stop you from seeing all of the different kind of arbitrary designations of citizenship and rights and humanity that we put on people in this country. And I know for me it was interesting. I was always really embarrassed to admit that I didn't have a passport. And I just got one about 3 weeks ago for the first time. And I didn't get one because I was a poor black single mom. And I couldn't afford one. And I couldn't afford to go overseas. And, you know, I was born in a small hospital in Texas that actually, I think, burned to the ground after we were born. My paperwork was a little weird and sketchy because my dad was born in Nigeria in like the 30s, and they don't have official birth records. So like my brother's birth certificate says that he was born, like my brother's a year and a half younger than me, says that he was, like on my brother's birth certificate says he's 37, and then on mine it says he's 35, like he's reversed aged. Because he was just like, I don't know, that wasn't a thing until the missionaries showed up and said, you're this age, you know, there was no thing. And I was always really embarrassed to admit I didn't have a passport. And, you know, I didn't have one because I couldn't afford one, and that is the case for many people of color. And then as my work continued, it became more and more visible. It became, people would just assume I had one. People would assume I went overseas all the time. And then I also, though, started to get worried. Like, what if I ever did need to leave? There's so much security in knowing you can go. But then I got kind of stubborn and was like, most of the black people I know personally don't have passports either, can't afford one. Can't afford the process, they don't have the time to go through the process to go and dig up their birth records and go find all these things and submit it and then pay the, you know, $150, $180, like $200 to get it. That was, and I remember plenty of times thinking I'll get one, and I had no budget for it for the longest time. And so then I got one. And at the same time I got one was when they were talking about how people who were born on the border of Texas were being denied entry back into the States. Yep. And I was reading and hearing about trans people who, some of whom I know, are being denied entry back into the United States. And so then I had this piece, and for like 5 seconds I had this, you know, feeling of like a little bit more security than many people in my position have, and then a bunch of fear because I had to fly to Toronto and wondering, like, am I going to find myself in this space? And I was realizing how for so many people that's never a consideration. It's never a consideration. You know, they've had their passport since they were small children. They used to love collecting stamps in them. They know they can use it for anything, and it's more of a luxury. It's not about security. It's not about a sense that if they need to go, they can go. And they never have, you know, they don't read these stories and they think, oh, that's so bad for those people, and they never consider where they are. And then at the same time, I was thinking, but at least I have this for now, you know, just in case. And it's so conflicting. And then to realize, you know, and I was trying to talk to people about this while I was in Toronto, and people were just kind of giving me this really blank look, like this isn't computing, except for one Nigerian woman, and she lives in the UK, and she was talking about how hard she had fought to get her UK passport, yeah, and all of the politics on it. But it just reminded me how something that can be given so freely to so many people with no problem, and it can mean so much to so many people, and then there's so many people who have no access to it, so many people who can be denied to it, and it's just this little book. And right now this administration on a whim is deciding. And so even if you have it, it's no longer, it's not the permanent thing it used to be. It's not this 10-year.
I'm totally convinced that Trump wins re-election. I made a documentary called White People for MTV about 3 years ago. And, oh, sorry. Like, what was that? Was that ice? Just kidding. Just kidding.
I thought my kid had made his way back in with his YouTube.
So I made this documentary, and the genesis of it was really, whenever I would go to the South or the Midwest to talk about immigration, the conversation always ended up being about race, right? And which is fascinating to me in that way, because I'm like, I'm talking here about papers, and they're like, well, you know, there's a Spanish aisle at Walmart. Why are they speaking Spanish? Are those Korean people or are they Vietnamese? What are they, right? And I was at the University of Georgia in Athens, And a college Republican president, the president of the college Republican, heckled my little talk. And so I kind of turned the table around on him, because, people of color are always used to getting asked, where are you from? Where are you from, right? So I'm getting into this habit of turning the question around and asking white people, hey, where are you from? I'm American, he says. Okay, I know, but where are you from? I'm white. Okay, well, white is not a country. Where are you from? And that moment when people who are ready to go after you starts kind of melting because they're realizing that they don't know what's going on. So he goes, I actually don't know, he says. And I said, well, how can you not know, right? Again, unless you're Native American, African American, because of slavery, who built this country, you have to answer 3 fundamental questions. Where'd you come from? How'd you get here? Who paid? The Philippines smuggled $4,500. Right? Unless you can answer those 3 questions, and I don't think you have any right to obsess over a border that you don't understand. And yet, we're assuming that this most diverse generation of white people in America are just, quote unquote, down with diversity, right? Without really, again, the inquiry of asking how they got here. I know that sounds kind of fundamental, but I would argue that that's the moment we're in now, is some of these fundamental questions, right? And when you were talking, I was just thinking about part of the dedication of when I wrote Citizen, and the cover of the book was when I heard from a young man in San Juan in Puerto Rico who emailed me right after Maria, when Hurricane Maria happened. And he was like, hey, Jose, I know you're not a citizen, but I'm a citizen. And I gotta tell you, it's not all it's cracked up to be. So I don't know if you really want that, man. And I was like, so I looked him up on Twitter, and I was like, oh my God, this young man, I think he's like 25, and you can see that for the first time in his life, just, in his timeline, he was just struggling with, we're here, we don't have any electricity, I'm using my iPhone, and he is a US citizen. And of course, people would say, wait, Puerto Rico is still a part. Yes, Puerto Rico is still a part. Actually, Puerto Rico became a part of the United States the same time the United States took over the Philippines. For some reason, y'all like Puerto Ricans more, so you kept owning them. And the Filipinos, you were just give them independence and we'll make them nurses and nannies. Just kidding, totally kidding. But to me, the moment we're in now are asking these harder questions of ourselves about what you were saying about the constructions of these systems. And my fear is that we may just be willing to scratch some superficial questions and are unwilling to actually get uncomfortable about the things that we got to get uncomfortable about, right? When I decided on this title, part of it for me was I had believed, because I was told when I was a kid, that people like me should earn our citizenship, right? Ever since I was a kid, whenever there was anything about illegal people, they always said, well, they have to earn their citizenship. And I thought, okay, that meant I had to have a really good resume, I have to talk perfect English, write perfect English, whatever that even is. And then it wasn't until I was arrested in that jail cell that I actually concluded, when I was writing this book, that home is actually not something I should have to earn. And then now I want to turn the question around and ask people, what have you all done to earn your citizenship? No, and I'm asking that as politely as I possibly can, right? All the while knowing that many people, it's an accident of birth, right? Congratulations. Is that how America got to be so great? Because, accident of birth, right? I would argue that undocumented people in this country actually exhibit a great amount of citizenship, because we choose to feed our kids, go to work, under an administration that talks about us like we're insects off his back. And yet, every day we choose to show up and participate. That's citizenship to me. What Colin Kaepernick is doing, that's citizenship. When you have to fight for it, and it's not just given to you. So that's the conversation that I'm trying to start, which I think a lot of people don't really want to have.
Yeah, I'm not surprised they don't want to have it. It's what you're talking to, for me, right, as someone who writes on issues of race, is fundamental whiteness studies, in whiteness studies in America, right? And looking at things like, because the truth is that the only people who are granted full citizenship in this country are white people. And if you don't know your story, if you don't know the story of how you got here, you don't realize that time that you traded in your marginalized identity for whiteness. And you don't realize what you signed up for. And I think what people are very afraid of looking at is what they signed up for, who they sold out, what parts of themselves they sold out to be a part of whiteness, to accept without question that they would get these sets of rights. Exactly, whiteness as a living, breathing thing, not your friend that happens to be white and your friend that happens, but like whiteness as its own structure, as a political, socio-economic structure. And people don't want to look at the history of that, because if you say, where are you from? That place you were from looks very different.
Actually, one time I remember I was in Arkansas, I think, and this young black woman, I could tell that she was getting really uncomfortable in this conversation. And she pulled me aside and she started just kind of crying and said, I went to Ancestry.com because I wanted to know where I was from, and I couldn't find it. And then finally her mom told her we couldn't find it because, when they took us, we didn't know what tribes we were from. So she was like, Mr. Vargas, I really want to be part of this conversation. And that for me was this was like 2012. That was a big moment for me that's like, oh my God, Jose, I have to really understand all the complexities of that, right? That's why at Define American, we have been very, very intentional about that, to make sure that we really, not only inclusivity, but complexity. We are a country that keeps insisting on simplicity. And it got us to where we are. It got us to this simpleton as a president, right? I'm sorry. Well, sorry, not sorry. Right? It got us to this simplistic part where make America great again. And again, he gets reelected by doing what? This is the political reporter in me, I can't shake it off. He gets reelected by saying that we're gonna repeal the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and birthright citizenship. And he's gonna say, let's take back America again. And he's gonna evolve Make America Great Again to let's take back America, and now you no longer get automatic citizenship. Because guess what? Apparently white people, I don't know what's happening in your bedrooms, but you're not having as many babies as people of color are. I don't know what's happening. People of color are having more babies than you are, and you're uncomfortable with that, so they're gonna take away birthright citizenship. And I wouldn't be surprised in this era that we're at if that actually works. What do you think? Would that work, you think? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I don't, the thing that scares me the most, first off, is how weak our resistance muscles seem to be to the very, very horrific things that have already been happening. How, if you study what happens all over the world in regimes much harsher than ours, and how people go out every day, knowing that their chance of success is almost nothing, every day and fight. They go out every day and protest because they believe in what the country could be. They believe in their rights. They believe in the people they're fighting for. And we go we'll have a march once every 2 years.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I do think, honestly, part of it is the fact that, in the 70s and in the 80s, the government locked up all of the leaders of our major resistance of color.
Absolutely. Yep,
and you do that, you scatter them to the wind, and they spend a lot of time perpetuating this myth that the new revolution was middle class, that if you could live the Cosby family life, which we all know didn't turn out that well, y'all, that you could, that would be revolution enough, right? Financial success. And it really took away that groundwork and that myth really took hold really strongly. And part of why we're out there fighting is we knew the myth wasn't real, but it took a while. And I think just now generations are finding out how untrue it is, but we don't have that structure anymore. And I think that that's part of it. And I think, I think that it's also just, the wider that divide gets, especially the economic divide between people, means that things have to get almost catastrophic before the great middle sees that there's a problem.
More than this catastrophe? You think it has to get worse before?
I don't know. When we look at the cities that are actually moving towards restructuring how they handle things governmentally, financially, educationally. It gets really bad before they do because everyone has no choice. And I don't want it to get to there. But I think that right now we just seem to think that, people are comfortable. And people think they're comfortable. I think it still isn't coming for them. I still see when I go and I speak to rooms full of people, the fear is not for what's happening. It's the fear for what they think might happen in 5 years. And that's not quite enough to activate them because they still feel really disconnected from the people who are impacted right now. And I think that divide that we've allowed to have, and when we look at, when we stopped doing things like busing, when we stopped affirmative action, we stopped all of these things that actually interconnected people and had them so that your friend, your neighbor was directly impacted. And Seattle is actually a great example. It is incredibly segregated.
I did not realize that.
Our schools are segregated, our neighborhoods are segregated. Our neighborhoods that used to have tons of people of color, you'll be the only person of color on your street. And it's very easy then for people to go, oh, what's happening in Georgia is awful. What's happening in Mississippi is awful, and not realize that there's people suffering in your own neighborhood.
I talk about this in the book. My biggest worry, after the election happened, I did a little census of my family. So there's 34 Filipino relatives of mine just in California. And everybody's either a US citizen or a green card holder. I'm the only one who's undocumented. And I did a survey of the 18 people who were eligible to vote. How many of them voted? 6. Of the 6 who voted, 3 voted for Trump because they loved him in The Apprentice. And the 3 people are Navy people, Filipino, Navy. And these are people who I'm Facebook friends with, who sees everything on Facebook, right? And then so I talked to the relatives, my aunts and my uncles who did not vote. And it was so interesting to hear them say that America to them is just, we just work here. America is something you eat, something you wear, something you buy, something you consume. It's not something you participate in. And then I thought about, then I had this really uncomfortable conversation. I grew up in Mountain View, in Silicon Valley. Actually, 2 of my high school classmates are here. I'm not gonna point them out because I'm gonna embarrass them. But I grew up in this area, and I was talking to some friends of mine from that area, and sometimes when I would hear them talk about, college admissions, they would say things like, oh, my kid couldn't get into Berkeley because, I'm sure there was a black or Mexican person. I'm like, what? I'm not, what did she just say? So where Asian people fit in this conversation, right? And especially now that Asian people are known, apparently we're the most educated, most affluent group of people in America now, although with the widest income gap.
If you don't look, you just can't look too closely at that number.
Numbers, the widest income
about
gap.
a third of the world's population.
Yes. So, but it's so dangerous though, this model minority myth and where we fit into that conversation. I mean, at least Latinos have Spanish in common, the language, right? And immigration has rallied, for the most part, the Latino community. The Asian community, outside of rice and noodles, what do Koreans, Japanese, Filipinos, Indians have in common? So organizing is a lot tougher. The Koreans take care of the Koreans, the Filipinos take care of the Filipinos. So even the API, and I'm saying this in Seattle, and Seattle is way more advanced than other places. Here, API groups actually work together. So what does that look like nationally? How do we actually talk about citizenship as participation? That to be in this country, it means you're a part of something, right? That to me is the hard question here. And I think it gets to your point about what are we willing to accept and what are we willing to get uncomfortable with?
Yeah, and I think part of it is, the narrative of what we've been told, right? If you came here, you're supposed to just be grateful for whatever you get. I think that we forget that I know so many white people who are born feeling that they get to shape the country in their image. And we forget that people of color have the right to shape the country in their image as well. And we've denied that in every narrative. Every immigrant story has completely denied. There's never been that part. There have been what America's done for people, how they've come up in the American dream, but not how the American dream changed to suit them, how their street changed to suit them, how their business changed to suit them. And part of that citizenship is that the way that the entire flavor of the country has to change a little. It cannot just be that we are absorbed into a pre-existing country, because the country itself didn't exist at one point. The country itself came in and posed itself on things, and it was a collection of people. And we are a part who have just as much right to shape that country. We have just as much right to say that these policies need to reflect who we are, and it includes what we bring. And I think that after so many generations of being told that that is a preposterous thing for any person of color, especially an immigrant, to ask for, it becomes a question that many people don't even ask. And I'm glad to see people asking it and saying, no, I am actually a citizen, and this means that this is my country, and I get to say that I want things to look a particular way. Quick reminder, guys, fill out your questions, because we're going to do questions soon. I want you to take like a minute or two to talk a little bit more about the work you're doing just outside of the book.
Yeah.
Before we kind of get into
So
the
I know
Q&A.
that you're going to take your phone out and you're going to text USA to 41411. So the biggest part of what we're doing right now that I'm really excited about, so I'm also gay. I've come out of, well, yay, thank you. I've come out of 2 closets in my life, and I have nothing more to share with you. I have no more closets to come out of. But I remember back in the 90s when I was in high school, what it was like to see Ellen DeGeneres on the cover of Time magazine, what it was like to know that Will and Grace was the #1 show on television. I'm still like amazed that trans women of color, Laverne Cox, Gina Lucero, Janet Mock, has led kind of this narrative shift around how we talk about trans issues in this country. All of those are cultural shifts that had to happen before policies and politics shifted. So right now, the biggest part of our work at Define American actually is precisely that. So right after DACA was rescinded, Trump announced he was, ending DACA. 2 of the very first people to reach out, because they're amazing people, one was Shonda Rhimes. Shonda was like, how can we help? And then she said, I want to put a DACA storyline on Grey's Anatomy. So there's about 100 undocumented medical students that we know of in the country. By the way, once their DACA expires, we don't know what's going to happen to them. If the hospitals will accept them, will let them practice medicine. So we sent, I think, 5 undocumented medical students to the writers' room of Grey's Anatomy, and they built an entire episode around this woman who has DACA, who's a surgeon, who's an intern. Now, after the election, the New York Times published a report saying the television show you watch is a greater indicator of who you voted for than anything else. And guess what? Grey's Anatomy, one of the top 10 shows for Trump voters. Did you know that? Grey's Anatomy is one of the top 10 popular shows for people who voted for Trump. So our work right now is in Hollywood, if you're a television show or a movie and you're putting immigrants and immigrant storylines, where are the people you go to? So we're consulting on like 40 projects now. But this is something that the LGBT rights movement learned. Like, I don't know if you remember, like Alec Baldwin says something homophobic. He apologizes the next day and gives money to GLAAD. Thankfully, we live in a country where being anti-gay, for the most part, is no longer acceptable. In this country, you say something anti-immigrant, not only is it acceptable, you win the White House. So how do we, that to me is like, I know that in this woke resistance era, we're all quick to go on Twitter and get on fights with random strangers. How are you going to fight your own family members about this? So at Define American, for Thanksgiving, we usually do this gift of uncomfortable conversation toolkit that you can download and give a handout to your coworker or your uncle or your dad or whoever in the family that says these things about illegals. So for us, that's a really big part of our work. Cultural shift for us, we cannot change this issue until we actually change how people think of the issue. So we're really, really proud of that work.
Wow, that sounds wonderful. And I do think that it's going to make a real difference.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yay.
Oh, questions? Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to explain this.
I just want to say personally, it's really riveting to hear the 2 of you talk, so thank you so much for being together on this stage. Had some great questions submitted, but just wanted to start with a comment. This person wrote, as an undocumented person myself, I am very grateful to you for helping me find life and light when I feel invisible.
Oh.
So that comment came from someone in the room.
Thank you.
And that leads into this question. Did anyone try to talk you out of coming out as undocumented?
Oh yeah, 20 lawyers. 20 lawyers. But part of the thing in the book that to me is really important, as for everybody, every lawyer that said to me, are you crazy? The moment you do this, we can't help you, is all of those people that have not lied for me, but all the people that have held me while I was lying, passing, and hiding. and actually two of them are here. My dear friend Karen Williamson and her husband Matt Walker. Can you stand up? I'm so sorry. So, and their daughter Bridget. So, Karen and Matt have been a part of my life since I was in high school. And when I had to get a driver's license to get a job, Oregon was one of the 2 states that allow people like me to drive. Who do I know in Oregon? And Karen says, Matt's dad's in Oregon. Oh. So I actually put this in the book with their permission, of course. I wrote about how I was able to get a driver's license in the state of Oregon because of their help. And my high school principal, my high school superintendent, my teachers from Mountain View High School actually helped me get a driver's license. So I'm saying that because I want everybody to kind of imagine how many other people are doing that. And now at a time when it's actually dangerous for people like me to publicly come out, right? But look, for me, the question about privilege is, what are you doing to risk your privilege? I'm doing everything I can to risk mine. The question now is, what are you all gonna do to risk yours? So if you help, mentor, work with, go to school with someone who's undocumented, what are you willing to risk to speak up for them? And to me, it's beyond allyship, because allyship feels too activisty for me. I'm sure if I ever called Matt and Karen allies, I mean, they hosted my high school graduation party. I sang at their wedding, Miss Saigon, of course, I'm Filipino, right? Right, so I think they would be so offended if I just called them allies. Like, they're like a part of my family. So this idea that they were willing to risk that, and I have had that my whole life from all kinds of people, black people, white people, Latinos, Asians, right? And so I think that's the question now, is how many people are willing to do that?
Since I think we have 2 experts on whiteness on stage today, a couple sort of heady questions about whiteness. Do you think marginalized groups will be, quote unquote, invited into whiteness, like Latinos, Filipinos, East Indians, et cetera? I think the implication there is like non-black people of color, so that white people can maintain their ideology majority.
You go first. Her book, by the way, is fantastic. She's going to be selling it as well there when I'm selling the book, but yes.
Oh, thank you. No. I would say that white supremacy works where we all have our ladders, our proximity to whiteness. I am a light-skinned black woman, so I have a higher proximity to whiteness than darker-skinned black people do. But whiteness was actually set up as a system of exclusion. So the people who can be led into whiteness were primarily people where that discrimination was set up before whiteness even really existed. Right? Whiteness existed with genocide and slavery to justify those 2 things. So before colonists came here and said, we need a way to make it seem okay that we're chaining human beings up, oh, here, this, whiteness and blackness and all these other things.
The construction of all of it.
Yeah,
Yep.
and so you had other groups that were oppressed in various ways, but the question of whiteness hadn't applied to them, and eventually they folded in. It would require the actual destruction of race in general in order for any other community of color to fold in. But like I said, we all have our proximity to it. Now, race and ethnicity are different things. Yep. So I know a lot of white Latino people who try their best to fold in, and they're there most of the time, but it's never full, because the thing about whiteness, just so y'all know, if you're ever thinking of making that trade, that bargain, is it can be revoked at any time and at will. It's not loyal. Whiteness is a hoe that is not loyal.
So I don't really know why people want to be a part of it. You know, when I was researching this book, the whole chapter on citizenship, the first time this country established citizenship laws were in 1796, and it said that only white people of good moral character could be a citizen. There was a famous case that I'm fascinated with, Osawa versus the Supreme Court in the 1920s, in which this Japanese man who was born in Japan but grew up in the United States, California, decided to sue the government, and because he claimed that he was white. He said, even though I'm Japanese, my skin is white, so don't I count as a citizen? The Supreme Court said, no. You may have white skin, but you're not white. You're Japanese. Right? And that reminds me, just because of the Asian experience in this country, and again, like, there are white Hispanics, there are a lot of Asian people who are like, well, we can just slid right in, right? So but I have to tell you, since we have a lot of white people in this audience, that thank you so much for coming. Like, no, seriously, thank you so much for coming. I'm about to actually work on a documentary that's a follow-up to White People called Straight White Guys. I know, I think they might really deport me after that. But my feeling about this, though, is I remember when I was working on White People, the MTV film, there was this young white woman in Arizona in a high school, and she said on camera that being white is the default. It's the center. And there was this young black woman right behind her, and you could tell that she was like, what, right? But then I kept thinking, oh my God, what a burden to carry around. To think that you're the center and the default, right? I actually think what we're living through right now is the burden that white people can't carry anymore. I found out too, the first time I ever heard the poem White Man's Burden was because of James Baldwin. It was the epigraph to The Fire Next Time. I didn't know that the subtitle of that poem, White Man's Burden, is the United States and the Philippine Islands. Rudyard Kipling wrote the poem to justify to the United States that they should take over the Philippines and begin empire. I would argue, at a time that we're living in, at a time when this country is increasingly getting white, although, you know, there's still a lot of you, which is great, you can't carry the burden of this anymore. If we're really going to exist together, you have to dismantle it. And people of color can't carry all that weight for you. You got to go do that yourself, right? And that, to me, is when fundamental change actually happens. That's when we get really uncomfortable. So I don't know what that's going to take. Maybe a second Trump presidency? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I'm not, before I get into, because I'm not going to tell you all my second book, because some of you might be writers in here. But, you know, like, a lot of what I spend a lot of time thinking is the unsustainability of the, okay, fine, I'll tell you, of the white male mediocrity that we've made a national product. And where we're at right now.
Can you repeat that again? No one's going to steal it. No one's going to steal it. Oh, yeah.
So, talking about white male mediocrity as a national product, as national identity. And we have made all of our socioeconomic decisions for the last 60 years or so to protect white male mediocrity as the epitome of the American dream. It stopped being you will be the greatest, you will create the most, you will create the newest, and it will be you will be born. And that's it. And you'll be fine. And you won't need to learn a new skill. You won't need to go to this, you won't need to invent anything. You won't need to be great at anything. You will be white and you will be male, and that will be great. And unfortunately, we live in a world that requires innovation. It requires, you know, hard work, and it requires creativity and all these other things that are excluded from that definition. And I think where we're at right now is the creeping realization of white America that that's not sustainable. And we're seeing more tariffs, we're seeing all of these things again to protect and say—
The suicide rates? Have you been looking at the suicide
exactly.
rate?
We're seeing all these things that are like, we don't know what else to do because our entire identity as a country, I mean, not my identity, the royal we, is built around that it is, you are great, because greatness, American greatness doesn't seem to have a big definition other than you exist. And that's not enough.
Oh, I finally figured out what existentialism was, because I was like, what is that? You know, at the same time I figured out that, you know, when I was a kid, I thought reading The New Yorker was like the thing. And I'm like, oh, irony. Oh, they think that's a thing, but that's my life is irony, right? Like kind of all these systems that we don't even try to understand. But I have to tell you though, as you're saying that, this is why working on Straight White Guys for me is important. Because when I do these events, and I visited maybe 400 colleges now because of what I've been doing, and also because of White People, the film that I made. I have been so, a lot of young white guys approach me and they just feel like they don't know where to go, right? And they feel like they can't say anything without being wrong. And for me, like, what happens when they internalize all of that? Like, I don't know where that goes. And so I want to be able to kind of go, okay, what is this really about, right? But that's uncomfortable for people to do. Yeah, so we'll see.
So this one is a little abstract, but I think maybe an interesting prompt. How do we go from the microcosm of day-to-day life to the macrocosm of a country?
Seattle, this was not the questions in Tulsa. What's going on? Can you say that again? Wait, what?
Microcosm of day-to-day, the macrocosm of the country. How do we go from that to
I think it might be sort of about activism too, like how do you activate a political consciousness out of this free
You know,
song?
I'm really tired of being an activist. I actually feel a little bit insulted when people just refer to me as an advocate and an activist, because I feel like all of us are activists. We just choose not to be. Right? So I get really offended as a journalist. My work matters a lot to me. When people, I was at this event a couple years ago and the guy was like, the former journalist, Jose Antonio Vargas, the former, what? Did somebody take away my press pass? Like, what is this? You know, and because apparently now I have an agenda. What? An agenda to be a human being? What's my bias to tell you that you're actually not talking about this, right? I think activism feels a little bit flaccid to me. Don't get me wrong, I think it's important, but I think we are now at a time in which everybody needs to figure out what their activism is. How are you going to be active in your own life in a way that gets us to a better sense of society, right? And I'm not saying that to minimize at all activism. I think it's so important, but I think it feels like it gives people an out because, oh, I'm not an activist, I'm not an advocate, I'm just this person trying to... No, your silence is activism. Your complicity is advocacy. You just make that choice and you're just making it easier for yourself. So I think the micro and the macro, actually in this book, that was one of the biggest things that I had to figure out. How do I tell a story so specific that it becomes universal? And I think for every writer, that's the goal, right? And so that's why coming up, I remember the first person I gave the book to when I finished the draft with mistakes was Michelle Alexander. I love Michelle Alexander. What the woman has done, what her work has done to raise consciousness about mass incarceration. I gave her the book because I said, hey, Michelle, is this accessible? And she said, yes. And she said, as a biracial black woman, she related a lot to passing. Right? And so I was like, okay, that's when I know that I have hit something that's just beyond my own condition. Does that make sense? And I think as a writer, for me, that's the most important thing. I only write so I can connect, right? So.
Let me add a little thing here too. If we're talking systems-wise, the micro is macro.
Yep.
So when we think about where we're at right now, Trump didn't just come out of nothing. These things don't come out of nothing. In fact, you don't have any more power than you have locally. So actually keep
Can you
thinking.
say that again? That's such a big one.
You don't. You have no more power than what you have locally.
Yeah.
And so keep thinking micro. Keep thinking your systems. And don't think macro like, I'm going to go hug my neighbor. That's weird. Stop doing that. But think micro like, I'm going to talk to my school board. And now the first thing I did after the election was email my school board and ask what plans they had in place to protect and defend undocumented children and children of undocumented parents. And that, knowing very well that you get enough school boards doing that, you get enough towns expecting that, then you get enough city council votes expecting that, you get enough state senators expecting that, and then eventually you get a president expecting that, right? These are the sorts of things where you have to remember that it actually all starts locally. All of these politicians came from some local place. All of these laws started with, polling local opinions, right? All of these businesses, they built their whole profit model around what their customers want, and those customers live in places. So the micro is always macro, and in fact, I would say focus less on the macro, except for to look at the whole story, to look at how it feeds together, but look at what you can do and how you interact with the various systems in your locality, and then you will find it having a macro impact.
I totally agree.
Thank you. So just a couple more quick ones, and then we're going to get to book signing. This is sort of a policy question, but it's a good one, so I thought I'd bring it up. It's also a great question for Jorge Barron, so a segue to say that there is material from the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project on your way out if you'd like to sign up for them or find out more. But so here's the specific question. It's about new public charge regulations. At this point, should we warn undocumented friends about the dangers of taking public services, or will our courts eliminate this new danger? It's a tough question about courts.
That's a really tough question. I'm getting a lot of that. And the thing about that too is that's built on a fundamental lie that undocumented people don't contribute anything to the economy. It's built on that fundamental lie. And I'm saying that as somebody who, I pay so much taxes, I should be a Republican. I'm really happy to pay it because I'm a product of public schools. I wouldn't be the person that I am without public libraries. I think the road should be paved. I get all of that. Like the safety net to me is not it's a real thing. We have to feel safe in this. We have to share what we have, right? And yet this happened because this fundamental lie that anti-immigrant hate groups that used to be fringe, that are now completely at the center and work at the White House, have led the American public to believe that we're just taking away people's welfare, right? So to answer your question, I've been really mixed on that because I feel like this is where your point, about the micro being the macro. It really depends on the community. It really depends on, I don't know, when somebody was asking me in, I think it was Wilmington, North Carolina, I was like, yeah, you may want to stop right now. But if they were asking me that in Queens, oh, no, keep going, right? So I think it depends. But this is why at the end of the day, every community has to decide who's welcome here and how do you define American. Every community has to decide that.
And I have one last question, but before I do, just the final announcement that there are books available for sale at the University Bookstore table, both copies of Dear America and Ijeoma's fantastic book. So you want to talk about race, judging from this conversation, I think a lot of us in this room could do with checking out both books for sure. And they will both be signing in that room afterwards. But this is a little bit of a softball, but it's a real question. I didn't seed this, and it's a great one always. What advice do you have for disillusioned young people?
I would read a history book. I find a lot of peace in history, actually. I've been recently rereading a lot of Frederick Douglass, by him and also about him, because his 200th year anniversary is about to come up. And as a journalist, I ended up majoring in African American studies in college and wrote a thesis on Frederick Douglass. And because I was so drawn by the fact that he was a journalist and he was a man of letters, right? And he used writing as to question America. And for me, that was like a model. And I find just a lot of peace reading about him and reading about, for example, I just finished this book on Irish American history. Like, I didn't really know, for example, all those coffin ships that they had to get on, and many of them died along the way. Ted Kennedy, I interviewed Ted Kennedy once when I was a political reporter, and he gave me a book about Irish American history, and I didn't really pay attention. So now I am. So I find a lot of comfort in that. And then, of course, there's Baldwin, right? Baldwin said, I cannot afford to be a pessimist because I am alive. To be a pessimist means that life is nothing but an academic matter. So I have to believe that I can survive what I can survive. And our history has shown us that we will and that we can survive what we have to survive. In many ways, this test that all of us are going through is testing not only our resilience, but really what America stands for. And I would argue that the people who have always been excluded and marginalized for it are a greater proof of it than anyone else. So, thank you.
Jose Vargas, Ijeoma Oluo, Dear America, thank you so much.